9,904 crimes per every 100,000 residents. That's Washington Park on Chicago's south side right now. To break that down in simpler terms, that's 99 crimes for every 1,000 people living there, almost 10%. The national average sits at around 2,300 crimes per 100,000. Washington Park is more than 4 times worse than the average American neighborhood. According to Neighborhood Scout and multiple crime analysis sites, this place gets a crime grade F, not a D, not a C. An F, here's what really hits different: your actual odds of becoming a victim if you live here, 1 in 9. Every single year you got an 11% chance of being victimized by crime. Think about that for a second. In a classroom of 27 kids, 3 of them will be crime victims this year. In an apartment building with 45 units, 5 families will deal with some form of victimization. Those are better odds than most lottery tickets, except you're playing a game nobody wants to win. Only 1% of neighborhoods in the entire United States rank as more dangerous than Washington Park. That means it's worse than 99% of American communities. In Chicago specifically, it consistently ranks in the top 3 to 5 most dangerous neighborhoods, and some years it's held the #1 spot citywide. When we talk about crime here, we're not discussing parking tickets or noise complaints. The statistics include serious violent crime, homicides, shootings, armed robbers, aggravated assaults. Property crimes like car theft and violent burglaries make up another chunk. Gang-related violence dominates the numbers. Drive-by shootings happen often enough that they're practically their own category. The geography matters too. Washington Park isn't uniformly dangerous across every block. Certain streets have crime concentrations that make the neighborhood average look tame by comparison. Specific intersections are known hotspots where violence clusters. Crime analysis shows that both violent crime and property crime rates are significantly elevated compared to safer Chicago neighborhoods. While a neighborhood like Lincoln Park might see crime rates in the single digits per 1,000 residents, Washington Park's numbers are 10 times higher or more. The concentration of crime in this relatively small geographic area means that resources like police, emergency medical services, and community support programs are constantly overwhelmed. The sheer volume of incidents makes it difficult for any intervention to gain traction. If you live in Washington Park for 5 years, your cumulative odds of victimization climb dramatically. The math is sobering. With an 11% annual chance, over 5 years you're looking at over 40% cumulative odds of being affected by crime at least once. For 10-year residents, the probability approaches statistical certainty. For long-term residents, the question isn't really if you'll be affected by crime, it's when and how severely. The economic impact of these crime rates extends beyond direct victimization. Property values remain depressed because who wants to buy in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America? Businesses struggle to operate or refuse to open locations here. Insurance rates are higher. Even getting basic services like delivery becomes complicated. These numbers paint a devastating picture. But what you're about to discover about the specific streets where this violence concentrates will show you that even within Washington Park, there are zones exponentially worse than others. Some blocks have statistics that make the neighborhood average seem almost safe by comparison. Let's break down what kinds of crime we're actually dealing with in Washington Park. The overall numbers are bad, but the composition of those numbers tells an even darker story. Violent crime rates here are significantly above national averages. We're talking homicides that happen multiple times per year in a relatively small geographic area. Shooting incidents get reported with alarming regularity. According to Chicago crime data, aggravated assaults involving weapons are extremely common. Armed robberies where perpetrators use guns or other weapons occur frequently enough that residents consider them part of life. The FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting System categorizes violent crimes as murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Washington Park sees elevated rates across all 4 categories. While exact numbers fluctuate year to year, the trend remains consistently high. Sexual assaults also appear in the statistics, though these crimes are historically underreported everywhere, so the real numbers are likely higher. The underreporting happens for various reasons, including fear of retaliation, distrust of police, and the trauma of going through the reporting and investigation process. Then, there's property crime. Vehicle theft is rampant in certain sections of Washington Park. Residents report that leaving a car parked on the street overnight is risky. Even during the day, vehicles left in certain areas are vulnerable. Catalytic converter theft has become especially common recently given their resale value. Burglaries happen both during daylight hours when residents are away at work and at night when they're home, which is particularly terrifying. Breaking and entering while occupants are present, known as home invasion, carries higher criminal penalties but still occurs with disturbing frequency. If you leave anything visible in your car, even something as simple as loose change or a phone charger, theft is almost guaranteed. Residents learn to keep their vehicles completely empty of anything that might attract a break-in. Vandalism and property damage are chronic issues that residents deal with constantly. Graffiti marking gang territory appears regularly. Property damage from conflicts between groups affects innocent residents' homes and vehicles. Package theft has become increasingly common with the rise of online shopping. Many residents won't have deliveries sent to their homes because packages disappear within minutes of being dropped off. Some have items shipped to their workplaces instead. Others use package lockers at nearby businesses. It's one more way that living in a high-crime area complicates everyday life. The gun violence factor can't be overstated. Firearms are involved in the majority of violent crimes here. According to crime analysis, Washington Park sees gun violence at rates far exceeding the city average. Drive-by shootings are a common gang tactic, often used for retaliation or intimidation. The really tragic part is that stray bullets have injured and killed children and innocent bystanders who had nothing to do with any conflict. These incidents make news briefly, but happen with enough regularity that they've become almost normalized in the area. Gun violence doesn't limit itself to disputes between gang members. Arguments between individuals can escalate to shootings. Robberies are frequently armed. Even domestic disputes sometimes involve firearms given their prevalence in the community. Residents report hearing gunshots regularly, some weekly, some even more frequently depending on their specific block. The sound of gunfire becomes a nighttime soundtrack that residents learn to identify and react to instinctively. The prevalence of weapons means that any confrontation, even something that starts small, can escalate to deadly force quickly. An argument over a parking space, a perceived sign of disrespect, a dispute between neighbors all carry the risk of gun violence. The risk profile changes somewhat between day and night. Violent crimes spike significantly after dark when visibility is reduced and fewer witnesses are around. Property crimes can happen anytime, though certain types like residential burglaries favor daytime when houses are empty and neighbors are at work. Not every street in Washington Park carries equal risk. The crime concentrates heavily on specific corridors and blocks that have earned reputations as particularly dangerous. Garfield Boulevard stands out as one of the most notorious streets in the area. Multiple sources cite it as a high-crime corridor where violence occurs regularly. The street runs through several South Side neighborhoods, but the sections passing through Washington Park are especially problematic. The 51st Street area has seen numerous shooting incidents over the years. Crime data shows this corridor as a consistent hotspot. Sections of Martin Luther King Drive running through Washington Park have high criminal activity. The street's name carries historical significance, making the current reality particularly tragic. Indiana Avenue, particularly in certain stretches, is known locally as dangerous. Residents who know the area understand which blocks of Indiana to avoid entirely. These aren't just random streets, they're major arterials that serve as disputed territory between different gang factions. Control of these main corridors means control of commerce, both legal and illegal. The intersections where these streets cross become flashpoints for violence as different groups assert territorial claims. Within Washington Park, certain blocks are significantly worse than others even on the same street. A single block might have drastically different crime statistics than the block right next to it based on which gang controls it, what illegal activities operate there, and what the physical environment looks like. Areas near public parks, which should theoretically be community gathering spaces, often see increased criminal activity instead. Washington Park itself, the actual park the neighborhood is named after, has areas that are unsafe, especially after dark. What should be a community asset becomes another danger zone. Blocks with abandoned properties attract illegal operations because there are fewer eyes watching and less chance of witnesses. These vacant buildings become sites for drug activity, weapon storage, or other criminal enterprises. The physical decay signals that no one is paying attention, which invites further problems. Street corners where drug dealing happens openly are high-risk zones. These corners are known to residents, to police, and to the dealers themselves, yet they continue to operate, sometimes for years, in the same locations. Some residential blocks have had multiple shooting victims within recent years. Certain addresses appear repeatedly in crime reports. Families living on these blocks experience violence as a recurring reality, not an occasional incident. Local residents develop detailed mental maps of exactly which blocks to avoid and when. This knowledge gets passed down and shared. Newer residents learn quickly from neighbors which routes are safer for walking, where not to park, which parks or businesses to steer clear of. The neighborhood is carved up into different gang territories. Gangster disciples have historical presence in sections of Washington Park going back decades. Black P stones control other areas. Smaller sets and factions hold specific blocks, sometimes violently defending territory as small as a single street corner. The boundary lines between these territories are especially dangerous. When you cross from one gang's area into another's, even unknowingly, the risk multiplies. These boundaries aren't marked with signs or painted lines, but they're absolutely real to the people who live there and to the gangs who enforce them. Being in the wrong territory at the wrong time can have severe consequences, even for residents who have no gang affiliation whatsoever. The territorial nature of gang control means that violence often erupts over perceived boundary violations or shows of disrespect, and bystanders can get caught up in it. Certain businesses known for illegal activity attract problems to their surrounding blocks. Locations where drugs are sold, where stolen goods are fenced, where gangs congregate, all create danger zones in their immediate vicinity. Areas with poor lighting and limited police presence become crime magnets. Infrastructure neglect has safety consequences. Streets that don't get adequate lighting, abandoned lots that don't get cleaned up, these physical environment factors contribute to crime concentration. Gangs dominate the crime landscape in Washington Park. Understanding their role is essential to understanding why this neighborhood has the statistics it does. Multiple gang factions operate within Washington Park's boundaries. The Gangster disciples have significant historical presence here stretching back to the organization's formation in the 1960s. The Black P stones are also active in certain sections. Beyond these major organizations, smaller sets and factions control specific blocks, sometimes just a few streets. The organizational structure of these gangs has evolved over the decades. What started as more centralized organizations has fractured into smaller, more autonomous sets. This fragmentation has, in some ways, made the violence worse because there are more groups with their own leadership making independent decisions about retaliation and territory. For young people growing up here, gang membership offers both protection and danger. In some parts of Washington Park, not being affiliated with a gang can make you a target. You're seen as vulnerable, fair game for robbery or violence. But joining one obviously brings its own massive set of risks, including arrest, injury, and death. The structure of these gangs has evolved over decades, but their power remains substantial. They control territory, they control illegal economies, and they influence daily life for residents, whether those residents want anything to do with them or not. Drug trafficking drives most gang revenue. Open-air drug markets operate on certain blocks in Washington Park. Heroin, crack cocaine, and other substances get sold in relatively plain sight. These markets generate the money that sustains gang operations, pays for weapons, and funds the lifestyle that attracts new recruits. The drug trade has evolved with synthetic opioids becoming increasingly prevalent. Fentanyl has changed the drug market nationwide, and Washington Park is no exception. The increased potency and danger of these newer drugs has led to more overdoses, even as it's increased profits for dealers. Illegal weapons trafficking represents another significant income stream. The guns that drive the violent statistics have to come from somewhere, and gangs facilitate that supply chain. Weapons flow in from states with looser gun laws and get distributed throughout Chicago's neighborhoods. Some gangs extort local businesses, demanding payment for protection. Small business owners face impossible choices: pay the extortion, risk violence, or close their businesses. Many choose to leave, which further depletes the neighborhood of legitimate economic activity. Stolen goods markets operate in the shadows, providing another revenue source. Everything from stolen cars to shoplifted merchandise to burglarized electronics gets bought and resold through these networks. Recruitment starts young. Middle school-age kids get pulled into gang life through various means. Sometimes it's older family members recruiting younger ones. Sometimes it's peer pressure from neighborhood friends who've already joined. Sometimes it's simply the reality that the gang controls their block and participation isn't really optional. When legitimate economic opportunities are scarce, the money gangs offer becomes tempting. A teenager who can't find a legal job that pays minimum wage can make significantly more working for a gang. The choice seems obvious to kids who see no other path to having money. Sometimes family protection requires gang affiliation because the neighborhood is so dangerous. Parents face the terrible calculus of whether their son is safer in a gang or trying to remain neutral in an environment where neutrality can be seen as weakness. Generational gang membership perpetuates cycles. Kids whose fathers or uncles were in gangs often follow the same path. It's what they know, it's their family legacy, and the connections already exist. Schools become sites of both recruitment and rivalry conflict. Gang members attend school alongside non-affiliated students. Territorial disputes and personal beefs play out in hallways and lunchrooms. School should be a safe space for learning, but in Washington Park, schools often reflect the same violence that exists outside. Getting out of a gang is extremely difficult and genuinely dangerous. Gangs don't accept resignations. Attempts to leave can result in violence against the person trying to exit or their family members. The phrase blood in, blood out reflects a reality where leaving the gang might require injury or death. The conflicts between gangs drive much of the shooting violence. Rivalries between factions result in regular incidents. Territorial disputes over drug-selling corners lead to shootings. Perceived disrespect, whether real or imagined, triggers retaliation. Social media has added a new dimension to gang conflict. Disrespect online, whether through posts, comments, or videos, can lead to real-world violence. Arguments that previous generations might have had face-to-face now play out publicly online, escalating quickly and involving more people. Retaliatory violence creates endless cycles where each shooting generates multiple revenge shootings in response. A member of one gang shoots a member of another gang. The victim's associates retaliate. Then the original shooter's gang retaliates for the retaliation. The cycle continues indefinitely, with each incident justifying the next in the minds of participants. Washington Park wasn't always synonymous with danger. To understand the current situation, you need to know what this neighborhood used to be and how it transformed into one of Chicago's most dangerous areas. In the 1950s and 60s, Washington Park was actually a thriving African-American middle-class neighborhood. Families owned homes with pride, local businesses prospered serving the community. The park itself served as a center for positive community activity where families gathered, kids played, and events brought people together. Schools functioned reasonably well, educating children who went on to college and careers. There was genuine community pride and a sense of safety that allowed normal life to flourish. Crime existed, as it does everywhere, but it didn't dominate daily existence the way it does now. This wasn't a wealthy area by any means, but it was stable. People chose to live here. It was home in the true sense of the word. Neighbors knew each other, communities looked out for their own. Social institutions like churches played central organizing roles. Then came deindustrialization. Through the 70s and 80s, Chicago's South Side lost the manufacturing plants that had employed thousands of residents. Steel mills, factories, and industrial operations that had provided solid working-class jobs for generations shut down or moved elsewhere. When those jobs disappeared, the economic foundation of neighborhoods like Washington Park collapsed. Unemployment spiked dramatically. Without work, people couldn't pay mortgages. Families that had been stable middle-class households found themselves in sudden poverty. Job loss led to concentrated poverty as entire communities lost their economic base simultaneously. As employment vanished, people couldn't sustain local businesses, so stores closed. The corner grocery, the barbershop, the local restaurant all began disappearing as customers stopped having money to spend. Property values crashed as demand disappeared and maintenance became unaffordable. Homeowners who could afford to leave started doing so, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Those who couldn't afford to move got stuck watching their neighborhood deteriorate around them. The tax base eroded, which meant city services got cut. Less money for schools meant larger class sizes, fewer resources, older textbooks. Less money for infrastructure maintenance meant potholes didn't get fixed, street lights didn't get replaced when they burned out, parks deteriorated. Everything that keeps a community functioning started breaking down simultaneously. It wasn't one thing, but rather a cascading series of failures that fed on each other. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s devastated what remained of community structure. As crack flooded into Chicago, Washington Park became a major market. Gang activity escalated dramatically as organizations fought over drug territory and the enormous profits involved. The violence during this period reached levels that older residents still talk about with trauma decades later. The homicide rate in Chicago overall spiked during the crack epidemic, but it was concentrated in neighborhoods like Washington Park. Multiple murders per week became normal. Addiction destroyed families and whatever social structures had survived the economic collapse. Parents became addicts, unable to care for children. Kids grew up in chaotic households without stability. The social fabric that had held the community together unraveled. The law enforcement response was often inadequate or actively made things worse through aggressive tactics that didn't actually reduce crime, but did damage community-police relations. Mass incarceration removed huge numbers of young men from the community, disrupting families and creating new traumas. Each wave of violence drove more stable families out of the neighborhood. Anyone with education or resources who could leave generally did. They moved to suburbs or safer city neighborhoods, seeking better opportunities and safety for their children. This brain drain removed potential community leadership and role models. The teachers, the nurses, the small business owners, the people who might have organized community improvement efforts, they left. What remained was concentrated disadvantage. Schools declined further as funding dropped and students came to class carrying trauma from the violence surrounding them. How do you teach a child who witnessed a shooting the night before? How do you maintain educational standards when students are dealing with hunger, homelessness, and fear? Physical blight from abandoned properties created environments that attracted more criminal activity. Buildings fell into disrepair, vacant lots filled with trash. The visual environment signaled abandonment and lawlessness. The lack of investment became self-perpetuating. Why would businesses invest in Washington Park when crime was so high? But without economic development, how could crime decrease? The cycle trapped the neighborhood. Living in Washington Park means developing a completely different set of daily habits and awareness than people in safer neighborhoods take for granted. Residents cultivate constant awareness of their surroundings from the moment they step outside. You learn to read situations quickly, to notice when something feels off, to recognize the signs of potential danger before it fully develops. This isn't paranoia, it's a survival skill honed through necessity. Avoiding certain blocks becomes second nature. People who live here know exactly which streets are riskier and plan routes accordingly. You might walk 3 blocks out of your way to avoid one particularly dangerous street. The difference of 1 block can matter significantly in terms of safety. Timing matters enormously. Residents calculate when to be outside based on when violence is more or less likely. Running errands or traveling through the neighborhood requires strategic thinking about timing and routes. You don't just decide to go to the store, you decide when to go based on safety calculations. Even clothing choices carry risk. Gang colors mean something here. Red might be associated with one gang, blue with another. Wearing the wrong color in the wrong area can lead to misidentification and violence. Residents learn to avoid anything that might signal gang affiliation, even accidentally. Neutral colors become the default. Certain sports team apparel can be risky if the colors match gang affiliations. Even something as innocent as a child's backpack color has to be considered. It sounds absurd until you understand the very real consequences of being mistaken for a rival gang member. Keeping a low profile is essential. Showing any signs of having money or valuables makes you a target. The survival strategy is to blend in, stay unremarkable, give no one a reason to notice you or think you might have something worth stealing. Don't wear expensive jewelry, don't carry the latest smartphone visibly. Don't drive a nice car if you can avoid it. These are the rules residents learn. Parents face impossible choices about their children every single day. Many walk their kids to school because letting them go alone is too dangerous, even if the school is just a few blocks away. This takes time that working parents often don't have, but the alternative is unacceptable. After-school activities are limited by safety concerns. A child who might benefit from staying late for tutoring or sports can't do so if getting home after dark is dangerous. Opportunities for enrichment get sacrificed to basic safety. Some parents don't allow their children to play outside without direct supervision, even in their own yards or right in front of their buildings. The kind of independent outdoor play that builds childhood development and creates memories isn't possible when drive-by shootings are a real risk. Kids growing up here learn from young age which areas to avoid and why. They develop the same hyper-awareness their parents have, except they're learning it in elementary school when they should be learning to read and do math without fear. Childhood in Washington Park means understanding danger in ways children shouldn't have to. Kids learn to hit the ground when they hear gunshots. They learn which sounds mean danger. They learn not to stand near windows during certain times. This knowledge becomes part of growing up here. Schools have metal detectors and security measures that feel more like prisons than learning environments. Students pass through security screening every morning. Bags get searched. The school building itself might be the safest place some kids experience all day, but the security measures required make it feel oppressive. These precautions are necessary given the reality of weapons in the community and the violence that spills into schools, but they create educational atmospheres that make learning harder. It's difficult to focus on algebra when you just walked through a metal detector and know that violence might erupt in your neighborhood on your way home. The mental health impact is severe, but rarely addressed adequately. Constant stress from living in a high-crime area causes genuine psychological damage. The hypervigilance required for safety takes a toll on mental health. PTSD is common among residents who've witnessed or experienced violence directly. Seeing shootings, finding bodies, being robbed or assaulted, these traumatic experiences leave lasting impacts that often go untreated. Children grow up with trauma that affects their development, their ability to focus in school, their emotional regulation, their long-term mental health outcomes. The adverse childhood experiences accumulated in Washington Park have profound effects that research shows last into adulthood. Depression and anxiety rates are high across the community. When your daily environment is genuinely dangerous and you have limited resources to change your circumstances, depression is a rational response. Yet despite all this, community resilience exists. Tight-knit networks of neighbors look out for each other. Churches and community organizations provide support. People find moments of joy and normalcy even in difficult circumstances. The human capacity for resilience is remarkable, but it shouldn't have to be tested this severely. 1 in 9 chance of being a crime victim every year. Let's put that in perspective against other risks we take seriously as a society and examine what it says about us that we tolerate this. Those odds are worse than many diseases we consider epidemics. We mobilize massive resources to fight health threats with better odds than 1 in 9. Think about how much money and attention goes into preventing conditions that affect a smaller percentage of the population. Yet Washington Park has lived with these odds for years without equivalent mobilization of resources or national concern. In practical terms, think about the people in your own life, your family, your friends, your co-workers. In a group of 9 people, 1 will be victimized by crime this year if they live in Washington Park. In an apartment building with 45 units, 5 families will experience it. In a school of 500 students, over 50 will be victims. These aren't abstract statistics, they're neighbors, real people with names and faces and families. They're kids who should be focused on school instead of survival. They're elderly residents who've lived in Washington Park for decades and watched it transform into something they don't recognize. Compare this to other risks we face. The lifetime odds of dying in a car accident are about 1 in 107. Being a crime victim in Washington Park each year is significantly more likely than dying in a car crash over your entire lifetime. We require seatbelts, airbags, safety standards, and crash testing for vehicles. We consider traffic fatalities unacceptable tragedies worth preventing through regulation and engineering. Entire government agencies exist to make transportation safer. But 1 in 9 annual victimization odds in an American neighborhood? That's apparently tolerable. We've collectively decided, through our policy choices and resource allocation, that this level of violence in certain communities is acceptable. The systemic failures are obvious once you look for them. Decades of underinvestment in Chicago's South Side created these conditions. The closure of mental health clinics, the underfunding of schools, the absence of economic development, these weren't accidents but policy choices. Policing strategies have failed to reduce violence significantly. Aggressive enforcement tactics may lead to arrests, but they don't address root causes and they damage community trust in ways that make cooperation harder. Meanwhile, community policing approaches that show promise remain underfunded and inconsistent. Economic development completely bypasses communities like Washington Park. New businesses, new jobs, new investment, they go to other parts of Chicago while the South Side remains starved for opportunity. Without legitimate economic options, illegal economies flourish. The educational system doesn't prepare students for success when schools are underfunded, understaffed, and struggling with the impacts of community trauma. Teachers do heroic work under impossible conditions, but the systemic support isn't there. Mental health and social services are grossly inadequate for the level of need. The trauma that residents experience requires therapeutic intervention, but those services are scarce and difficult to access. People suffering from PTSD and depression go untreated, and political will to truly address root causes rather than just manage symptoms is largely absent. Politicians talk about crime during campaigns, but rarely follow through with the sustained investment and comprehensive approaches actually needed to create change. Each generation inherits the trauma and limited opportunities of the previous one. Without massive intervention, there's no reason to expect fundamental improvement. Small gains made by community organizations and dedicated individuals get overwhelmed by systemic problems that remain unaddressed. The brain drain continues, removing anyone who achieves some success and could potentially provide community leadership. College-educated residents move away. Successful business owners relocate. The people who might anchor neighborhood improvement efforts leave for safer environments. The economic incentives of illegal economy compete with whatever legitimate work is available. When a high school student can make more selling drugs than working a minimum wage job, and college seems financially out of reach, the choice seems obvious. Hope becomes difficult to maintain when nothing fundamentally changes decade after decade. Older residents remember when things were better and have watched the decline. Younger residents have never known anything else. Here's the uncomfortable truth that we need to confront. We tolerate this in one of America's richest cities because we've chosen to. Resources exist to address these problems. Political will doesn't. The segregation, both racial and economic, that concentrates poverty and violence in places like Washington Park isn't accidental. It's the result of policy choices made over decades. Redlining, discriminatory lending, highway placement that destroyed black neighborhoods, disinvestment in public housing, these were choices. Compare the resources available in Washington Park to those in wealthy Chicago neighborhoods. Look at school funding, park maintenance, business investment, infrastructure quality. The disparities are stark, and they're not natural or inevitable. They're the result of how we've chosen to allocate resources. That 1 in 9 residents will be crime victims this year is a policy choice. We could choose differently. The question is whether we will.